Acceptance. Diversity is acceptance.
Diversity is life.
Diversity is understanding.
Diversity is priceless.
Acceptance.
All people working together.
Infinite.
Unity. Most definitely unity.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Uncomfortable Conversations that Ignite Change. My name is Joanna Aguilera, and I have the great pleasure of serving as Executive Director of DLA. Before we get started today, we have something that we wanted to do that is new to us, but something that we felt compelled to add as we begin each program, which is a land acknowledgement. So what DLA would like to do is recognize the home on which we are built. We are built on the homelands of the Akuma O'odham and Peeposh peoples. So I want to make sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. So if we've got any indigenous folks, if you would make sure you just in the chat area, let me know how I did on those. Those were new terms to me, new tribal terms. So I wanted to make sure I was not butchering them. What we want to do is acknowledge the people, the ancestors, their descendants, and most importantly, the land itself. The statement acknowledges that colonialism is not a past event, but an ongoing process of which we are a humble part of. So welcome to all of you. If you would like to do your own land acknowledgement and see what land you are on in the area you're living in, you can definitely do that. Dr. Scholar has dropped in the chat the website for you to go and see what land you are on. So good morning to all of you. Our 2021 DLA Dialogue Series was designed as a community space. This is a space where all of its members can listen and learn. Each webinar is designed as an opportunity for you to have meaningful, open, and honest conversations. And those conversations then become turning points and actionable items that can help to ignite change. Our desire is for people to walk away feeling transformed and like they have some additional tools in their arsenal that they can begin to ask important questions that get to the root of the insidious nature of racism and inequity across various systems. These powerful dialogues will uncover the inequities we see in education, that we see in healthcare, that we see in food accessibility and insecurity, and also in technology. By having these meaningful dialogues with corporate members, community members, and nonprofit members, we hope to eliminate some of the racist thoughts, racist behaviors, and actions, and encourage you to become advocates for social justice for all. So let the work begin. Today's webinar is our fourth installment in our dialogue series, Uncomfortable Conversations that Ignite Change. Our theme this month is the digital playing field. How racially equitable is it? In this eye-opening webinar, we will address the educational risks that students of color face due to systemic inequities and lack of access to technology. As students went online with virtual learning, many of our students of color struggled as they did not have access to computers, high-speed internet, or reliable Wi-Fi, making it very difficult to be successful in the virtual learning environment. Our expert panel of educators and community advocates and trainers will discuss with you the disproportionate socioeconomic and racial gaps that exist for students of color around technology. Today's panel will also examine how, if persistent and not resolved, This digital gap could put even more students of color at risk of falling further behind. Before we begin today's panel, I would just like to remind everyone that this is a community space. And as a community space, we just have a few rules of engagement for you. At this time, I would like to invite Dr. Brett Scholar on to share our community rules of engagement with you.
Reminder to everyone that our duty here at DLA is to keep this space safe, positive, and productive. So we want to make sure that we're listening actively and be open to the full spectrum of perspective. We want to commit to foster greater empathy. We want to try to relinquish the need to be right, ask questions and seek clarification for understanding, be respectful to the presenters and other attendees. No one or two individuals should dominate a discussion, even in the chat area. Approach each other with kindness and love. And as a community space, we do have to say we reserve the right to remove you from the discussion if you become disruptive. So we also want to take a moment to share with you our wonderful ASL services that we have today. Today we have Heather and Jasmine signing for us, and we especially thank Equal Access Services and Dave Wallenhemp for their continued partnership.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Scholar. I appreciate your continual support of Diversity Leadership Alliance. I would now like to take the time to introduce you to the panel of experts that will be helping to lead today's discussion. Our first panelist is Dr. Earl Aguilera. Dr. Aguilera is an assistant professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at California State University, Fresno. He is an award-winning teacher educator as well as an internationally recognized scholar on issues at the intersection of literacy, technology, and educational equity. Dr. Aguilera's approach to teacher education draws on his experience as a high school English language arts teacher and K-12 reading specialist, working with students of marginalized background. He now works to understand and support the ways that young people are using digital technologies to navigate and challenge social and educational inequities in their own lives. Good morning to you, Dr. Aguilera.
Good morning, Joanna, and good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for having me.
Excellent. Joining Dr. Aguilera is going to be Marie Casal. Marie is a program officer with the American Indian Science and Engineering Society. Through ACES, Marie is able to work with tribal communities across the nation to implement computer science curriculum embedded with cultural pedagogies. She is a proud member of the, I was gonna get it right, Marie. It for me, Marie? The tribe name?
Narragansett.
Narragansett. I was practicing all morning. Thank you. She is a proud member of the Narragansett tribe of Rhode Island and has worked in and around her local tribal communities within California in the field of education. She is currently pursuing a master's in education in curriculum and instruction at Fresno State and plans to finish her studies very soon. Marie loves to travel and makes beautiful beaded earrings as a hobby. Good morning to you, Marie.
Good morning, and good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. And I just want to acknowledge where I personally live in California. I am on Yocut lands, which is in the Central Valley of California. So I wanted to make that acknowledgement since I'm not in Arizona today or at all.
Welcome that. Our next panelist is Dr. Adero C.E. Allison. Dr. Allison is the Assistant Director in the Student Accessibility and Inclusive Learning Services SAIL department at Arizona State University. Spanning over 40 years working with people with disabilities, her background is a tapestry of music, disability, and social sciences. Her focus is on systems change related to disability, equity and inclusion, organizational growth, and personal transformation. She serves on the ASU Shaping EDU Universal Broadband Initiative Committee, where her focus is on the many people who need but have limited or no access to this essential tool for education, work, and social connection. Good morning to you, Dr. Allison.
Good morning. I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
Wonderful. Last but certainly not least is Paul Signorelli. Paul is a trainer, presenter, and consultant, and the author of Change the World Using Social Media. Paul is a results-driven San Francisco-based social media strategist with more than 20 years of experience working with a variety of companies, organizations, and community groups. He believes in building opportunities through community collaborations and lifelong learning, positively transforming workplaces and extended on-site and online communities. He also serves as a member of the ASU Shaping EDU Universal Broadband Initiative Committee. A warm DLA welcome to you, Paul.
Thank you. I am very excited to be here. I'm looking forward to learning with all of you during this session.
Excellent. Well, let us begin. What I would like to do is just kind of set the stage for what you as panelists, you as attendees can learn from our panelists this morning. From today's panel discussion, you as attendees will learn effective strategies and long-term solutions that schools and districts and parents can implement that are both practical and economically feasible. You as attendees will also hear about actions that you can take as educational allies in the pursuit of transforming and closing the technology gap. So before we begin, we've got about 100 or so of you on with us today, and I know more are coming in. What I would like to do is I would like to begin before we even bring our panelists in to ask our first question with a poll. As you guessed it, because this is a webinar on technology, we're going to be using some technology throughout. So here's your first poll question. Rate your access to broadband. Is it great? Is it adequate? Is it poor? Or are some of you out there going, what's broadband? We'll give you just a few seconds to get your votes in, and thank you for those that are voting. Excellent. We've got the polls going up. Great. Okay, thank you so much. So let's look at the results. We've got about 58% of you that says your access to broadband is great. We've got about another 35% that are saying my access is adequate. And then about 7% of you saying, what's broadband again? So great, you're in the right place to be able to kind of get some information as you kind of move through the panel. So let's begin the discussion. What I would like to do is I would like to start by really framing and defining the digital divide and the problem as we see it. So what I would like to do, and I'd love to start with Dr. Aguilera, is for all of you, can you define the digital divide as it relates to your specific area? And then if you could, share your own personal experiences with the lack of digital access. Dr. Aguilera, please.
Sure, thank you. So once again, hello everybody, Dr. Aguilera, also joining you from the occupied territory of the Yokuts peoples here on the west coast of California. Oftentimes, I've tried to spend some time before this panel getting a sense of what other folks have said about the digital divide, right? Some of the different kind of discourses that are circulating. And I think oftentimes two of the big words that we hear about the digital divide center on issues of access. So whether or not there is the infrastructure that people have or the technology, right, the material that people need to access the internet. And then I also hear folks talking about affordability, which is also really important, right? Because that lens then allows us to see that digital divides don't just exist between urban and rural areas, but also exist within, right, those areas, within urban areas in particular. And we can obviously think about the ways that access to technology, socioeconomic class and race overlap, right, and track together in terms of our statistics. One analogy, though, I'd like to throw out there for folks, because again, of my own work in the digital literacy space, is while we often use the analogy of universal electrification, right, as a way to think about the importance of universal broadband and the importance of having access to the internet. One other analogy I'll invite us to think about is access to clean water, in particular in the United States, right? And the reason why I offer water as an analogy is because while so many communities have the infrastructure to access water, there are communities of color, predominantly Black communities, and Indigenous communities that have not had access or have had very limited access to clean water in the last 5 years. This is the 2020s already, right? And the reason I think about that in relationship to the internet is because if you take seriously, right, the words of historian Melvin Kranzberg, you understand that technology is not a neutral tool, right? And just because we can get the internet flowing to somebody doesn't mean we have the right protections in place so that Black communities, Indigenous communities, and communities of color are not being disproportionately targeted by disinformation, misinformation. And right before we got onto the call, talking about issues of anti-Asian hate across the United States, it was less than a year ago today that individuals at the highest levels of federal and state power here in the US were actively encouraging anti-Asian sentiment. So let's not forget, right, that water is great. Everybody needs access to water, but so too do we need access to clean water, right? And I think about that a lot in terms of the digital world that we continue to build for our young people to navigate. I hope that kind of addresses a little bit of both dimensions of your question, Joanna. So let me pass it on to the next panelist.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Maria, I'd like to go to you. Could you share kind of how you define the digital divide and what your own personal experiences have been with the lack of access?
All right. Hello again. My name is Marie. So I would define the digital divide more so a digital inequity, right? Lack of access to resources and to tools and ways to mitigate it. My specialty, the communities I've worked with have typically been tribal communities. So access for in town, let's say, if you are nearby a reservation, you may have had access to internet for decades now, but maybe the reservation that's bordering you barely just got it in the last 5 years. So my local reservation that I have worked a lot with in their education department, they barely within the last 5 years have tribal members getting internet inside their homes. Usually they'd have to go to the gym or to their little library center to access internet, and that was it. And now with better signals, right, with cell towers, some of them can actually get internet on their phone now, or at least if they have access to Wi-Fi, a Wi-Fi hub, they can go on their phone and check their emails, right? Working with students, if you live in town, let's say, and you have a community of Native students, and they go home to the reservation, sometimes they have a bus trip of over an hour they take to get to school every day. And people don't really acknowledge they're getting up at 5:30 in the morning to go to school every day. And then getting home sometimes at 6 or 7 at night. And then they get home and they don't have access to internet. How do these high school students, middle school students do their homework, right? And then with COVID, when it's 100% online, right? Now they just are completely cut off. There's lots of reports where they're going to McDonald's, right? They're having to drive into town, and not every person in a rural community or a rural, especially a Native tribal community, has access to get to a bus or get somewhere if they don't have a vehicle to get to those resources. So there is, through the government, we have programs in place to try to get more internet and broadband to these communities, but the communities themselves have to do all this paperwork, and sometimes it's kind of over their heads and they don't understand. No one's really helping them get through it. So it's just the more advantaged communities that happen to have someone to interpret all this legal information can get them to try to install systems. There are some tribal communities that are also trying to do their own infrastructure, like their own intranet on their communities as well. So we have over, I think it's 576 or 67 federally recognized tribes in the US. That doesn't count unrecognized tribes, which there's plenty of those as well, hundreds of those. So if you are federally recognized, you do have access to certain things. You are a sovereign nation, which I think we're going to go over later. But if not, then you're completely left in the dark without access to these resources entirely if you're not federally recognized. So my specialization is more in tribal communities. So I will be giving more of that perspective today. I personally, again, have worked in Native communities, and I've seen like trying to just do a simple little survey on their little tablets, and then whoop, the internet's out and everyone's just kind of blacked out for the day. And we're like, oh, well, so we mostly rely more on paper and pencil because we have to, right? And that is a struggle right now with COVID, with digital, problems, having access to equipment and everything. So
that is such a great perspective, because I think for many of us, we are very privileged, right? In the idea that, I can grab my phone at any time and I know that I've got Wi-Fi. If the Wi-Fi goes off, I know I've got, a hotspot on my phone and all of those things. And I think that has probably those images of seeing people of color outside of Burger Kings and fast food restaurants and Starbucks with their laptops, third graders, fourth graders, logging in to do their homework because they have such a commitment and thirst for the learning, and are not going to let that hurdle, right, be what prevents their access, has been one of the most disheartening things I have seen. And they're usually people in communities of color, marginalized communities, that are really trying to use the tool, those laptops that we gave them, but they don't have the reliability or access to internet. And that has been, like I said, one of the most disheartening things, because it's always within sort of our communities. I want to just remind everyone that's on, if you've got questions, comments, observations, go ahead and for observations or comments, put them in the chat. But if you've got a question for our panelists as we're going along, something that triggered a thought, go ahead and put it in the Q&A area, and we'll ensure that as we move along, we're able to answer those. So definitely, if you've got something you want to know more about, please let us know. So Paul, let me bring you in now. I would love for you to share your personal experience with digital access and what that digital divide looks like to you.
Let's start with the story. I'm here in San Francisco, right on the edge of the Silicon Valley. The assumption would be we do okay here. About 3 months into the pandemic, I was walking around town because I've worked for public libraries. I've been affiliated with them for many, many years, and now as a consultant, continue working with them. Walking through my neighborhood, I walked by one of my neighborhood branches, which of course was closed to the public in terms of the physical building, but still open in terms of making lots of online resources available. And this particular day I'm thinking about last July, I'm walking by and I see somebody in the bushes up against a building, sitting there hooded because it was kind of cold outside, San Francisco summer and all, sitting outside with a laptop. And my curiosity got the better of me. So I walked over and said, "Are you here to use the library Wi-Fi?" And the answer is, "Yeah." I said, "You're here in San Francisco and you do not have access to the internet in your own home?" And the answer was, "That's right." And I thought, we need to be moving past our assumptions about who has and who does not have access in this country. When we move out to the broader question that you just asked, Joanna, about what's the digital divide, I fall back on something I heard from a wonderful colleague who's been a broadband advocate for about 30, 40 years, Arlene Krebs here in California on the coast. She's done so much work in the area. She actually was termed a broadband activist or broadband champion and got an award for that. About the same time I'm thinking here about that San Francisco story, Arlene and I were talking a little bit about broadband, and she says, digital divide no longer captures it. It's not just a digital divide, it's a socioeconomic divide. It's a racial divide. It's an opportunity divide. And that's been something that I've seen, and I'm sure everybody on this panel has seen as we work, those of us who were on that Arizona State University Shaping EDU initiative to promote universal broadband. We all see this, that it's not just the equipment, as Earl said earlier. It's not just the technology, it's how people are hooking up. Marie said a lot of the same things I've been thinking. And if we look at this in the broader, larger terms of not just technology, but the people and what it does to them, then we have created the framework for a positive discussion that can take advantage of what we're seeing as it's all over the news. And you just cannot avoid seeing the effect that lack of broadband has on students. the effect that lack of broadband has on workers, the effect that lack of broadband has on people in terms of healthcare issues. Think of something as simple as trying to get your COVID vaccination. You try to set that up, you don't have an internet access, what are you going to do? You may be able to go to your local library and use your telehealth services there if their physical buildings are open, but this is a major challenge. And I'm glad we're having this discussion, because from the discussion can come positive action.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Dr. Allison, I would like to bring you in now. And I know that with the area you work in there at SAIL, there are kind of other overlays, right, to this issue in terms of the digital divide. Would love to hear your perspective, please.
Thank you. I really think of the digital divide as an evidence of structural inequality in our society. When I was working in a rural community in Oregon at the beginning of the internet access, one of the things that I did was I participated with a small group of people to identify a way to bring internet into the community. The community college had internet, the university in the next city over had internet, but the students didn't have internet when they left the campus. So we wanted to find out how you could bring internet into that community. And we found there was at that time a 1 square mile area where you could bring in a T1 cable, and it went to City Hall. And we were able to convince them to allow us to use a closet to put 1 server in so that people could dial up to access the internet. And that provided an access to the community that the city hadn't put it in, the county hadn't put it in, the state hadn't done anything. And too many people were hearing about this thing, maybe in their newspaper or on television, but not ever having access to use it. The situation continues today. And, when we think about people being able to access broadband, we kind of have this notion that, oh yes, Verizon or whomever is all over the country, it's 90 to 99% accessible. But one of my students lived in rural Oregon in a house that had no running water and no electricity. That was by choice until she had a disability that required her to do something different in order to support her family. And so she was coming to school and able to learn to use technology, but she would never have been able to use it at home. That situation still exists around our country for people who either don't have the funds or don't have the infrastructure to get online.
That is wonderful. Thank you for that. We talked about technology earlier when we said we're going to use it. So we're actually going to ask you, and Brent will put it in the chat area, to download this Mentimeter link, because what we would like to do is tee up our next set of questions by doing a quick word cloud that gets us to hear from you. In this webinar environment, it can sometimes be a little tough that we're not seeing all of your lovely faces, 100 of you that are on with us today, but we want to make sure we hear your voices. That's very important to us. So in the link, you've got a Mentimeter poll that has been put up with that link there. So just copy and paste that into your browser. And the question is this: what does the digital divide mean to you? When you hear that, what do you think of? And you'll get an opportunity to put in a few words, I think about 3 words or so, but we would love to hear from you. What does the digital divide mean to you? And as we're getting that kind of in, I would love to tee up our next question, and then we'll review that word cloud when we come back in. So as we're talking about the digital divide and the impact it has on communities of color, I just want to share some quick high-level statistic. Again, there's a lot of research out there, and what we always invite you to do is do your own research. Do your own research. I'm a huge proponent. I always tell my students, if you want to know more, dig deeper, right? Do a deep dive so that you have context and you're not relying, on the internet to tell you what the problem is, because that's a whole nother sidebar, right? In terms of information on the internet. I always tell my kids will come and go, "Mom, this is happening." I said, "Where'd you see that?" "On TikTok." And I'm like, right. So, and for them, that's the holy grail of if it's on TikTok, it's real, right? And so I have to kind of, decipher the information with them to say, okay, what's the source? Who's this person? You got to dig a little deeper, right? But I want to read some statistics for you while you're accessing the word cloud. According to governing.com, there are over 31 million Black and Brown Americans that cannot afford digital technology. 31 million. That's a lot. That's a lot of people, okay? And then also when you look at that, that is what is contributing to some of the economic barriers that we have in terms of the digital divide and its relation and correlation to racial and ethnic groups. I love the word that Dr. Aguilera used, this universal electrification. That's the first time I had heard that. So again, for me, I want to be able to kind of dig a little deeper into that, but also agree with what Paul has said about this being a socioeconomic divide and a racial divide. That is definitely so, because there is data out there that says US households with income below 35,000 account for 28% of all of the households. Now think of that number, okay, 35,000 or below, 28% of the households. Yet that number, the 28% of those households, are 60% of them do not have broadband subscriptions. 60%, okay? So that means that's a huge, portion of the population that has no access to broadband at all. And research is showing this direct correlation between the lack of digital access to other very significant educational markers, such as science, math, and reading proficiencies among our students of color. So what I would like to do, and Brent, I don't know if we've got the word cloud ready to go. I'd love to review that. Excellent, thank you so much. What I will do is just read for you some of the terms you entered in. Thank you all so much for using the technology. That's the first time we've used that, we're excited. The digital divide and what it means to you, our attendees. It means isolation. It means lack of access, disparity, disadvantage, racism, privilege. We're seeing boundary, lost opportunity, missed opportunity. This is wonderful. Then we see challenge. Then we see digital service division. We see obstacle. And somebody even said intentional. Interesting, right? So there's some intentionality here. And so for this, thank you so much. We've got boundary, exclusion, behind. And this is really important because as the digital divide, it is kind of how we perceive the digital divide. So I want to kind of now focus on, as a panel, the digital divide and how it's affecting and impacting both our marginalized communities, and that's including kind of tribal sovereignty nations, and also how is it affecting our non-neurotypical students and adults, and anyone that has any kind of variation of cognitive function. So I'm gonna start with actually Marie. Marie, could you talk about the digital divide and its effect, how it affects and impacts marginalized communities, more specifically from your vantage point, the tribal sovereignty nations?
All right, hello again. So I want to take a moment because a lot of people do not realize that tribal nations, especially the federally recognized tribes, are considered sovereign nations. And if you're not sure what that means, basically sovereignty means you control and have access to instilling your own government. So each federally recognized tribe will typically have their own tribal council, or they use the terms governor, sachem, right? Chief, they have their own systems in place. They're allowed to have their own courthouse, do everything internal. They can have their own police, health, everything. They have access to that and to make that on their own. And so sovereignty is a little bit different. They don't have 100% privileges. Of course, the US government isn't going to give them 100% go wild, let's say, because of course they still want to restrict the tribes and they still want some control over these entities. But for the most part, they can handle most things internally on their own. And like I mentioned before, they do get access to certain things because of so many treaties broken. And we know with the Trail of Tears, displacement of Native communities, the genocide of Native communities, putting them a coastal community in the middle of Oklahoma and expecting them to thrive. Are you? No, you're not, right? Instilling things like blood quantum into tribes, which not all tribes do that. Mine personally does not. It does lineage, but many tribes, especially big nations, do blood quantum. And that's also another form of genocide, because no one's going to be 100% of anything forever, right? Within their own tribe. Also with tribal people, you're only allowed to claim one tribe. So if your parent is one and your other parent is another, your child, you have to make that decision of what tribal group will your child be known as legally. So it happens in Canada too with First Nations. We're legal citizens or legal members of our tribe. We have our own ID cards, just like a license, basically, and people are not aware of this. TSA is supposed to acknowledge that as a federal form of ID, but they don't half the time because they're like, what is this? And they don't acknowledge that, hey, we're sovereign nations. We have our own IDs. This is a form, a lot of them with voting, they won't let them use that as a way to vote, right? A lot of communities do not have access to voting, right? They can't use postal boxes, and a lot of reservations rely on postal boxes as well. So just a lot of these inequities that don't apply to, let's say, the everyday community. When we think of rural, we think of, oh, those little country towns, those little farmers, right? And it's a little bit different. We're talking about rural Native communities that are in the middle of South Dakota, right? That don't have that access to internet. They don't have that access to other things that you would if you were by a major city area, right? And have that equitable access, right? So hopefully that kind of gives kind of a broad overview about tribal sovereignty, and how the digital divide plays into it. Is, again, there's all these extra laws. There's also, treaties. There's also these extra rights that we don't understand. Most people don't understand that Native communities have. And due to that, like I mentioned earlier, right, the government will say, oh, we'll help you get internet, but you got to fill out all these forms. You got to jump through all these hoops, right? Versus if I lived in town, I just call up whoever my local person is and be like, hey, Charter, can you hook me up today, right? But you can't do that on a reservation, let's say. So there's a lot of different hoops to go through. Also in urban, so if you're an urban native, I'm considered an urban native. I live outside of my community. So I'm considered an urban native. I live in more city populated area. Even in just small country towns where I live in California, I was stuck where you only have one provider, Verizon. All right, I have to pay over $100 a month to pay for Verizon. And the speed was horrible, even though I was trying to pay the most for the top tier, and it was still horrible and would get throttled during certain parts of the day when everyone's using it. So living just in a more country area, even in California, in which you think, oh, it's California, like Paul mentioned, it's San Francisco, everyone's got to have access, right? But that's not necessarily the case, especially in country towns where basically you have these monopoly systems set up. And so my grandma just lives 15 minutes away, has never had internet ever, just because it's not, who's going to pay over $100 to have crappy internet? So that's part of that digital divide. So we have a lot of urban natives, right, that spread out into these rural communities surrounding the reservation systems. And they still don't have access, even if they're, let's say, in a city environment, because who's going to pay $50, $60, $100 every month, right? It's not a utility. It should be a utility, right? Where you can get care program discounts like you can with electricity. You should be able to do that with internet. But as far as I know, that's not really something available. So those are a few things that I think add to that digital divide.
That is wonderful, Marie. Thank you so much. I wanted to just mention here, we are lucky to be sponsored and supported by Cox Communications here in our area. And I will say that our partnership with Cox, they are really kind of trying to change that. They've got a wonderful program I just want to mention here, which is their, let me get the name right, Connect to Compete program, which is something that they do where you get access, offers high-speed internet access at $9.95 a month, no contracts, no deposits, no installation fees, and you also get a free Wi-Fi modem. So when I heard about that, I was very pleased, and I think they're doing that in quite a few areas. And what they did for 2020 even, they kind of doubled the internet speed, and they were offering 2 months of free service if you signed up. So for someone like Cox Communication, they're trying to kind of address it in some way. But Dr. Aguilera, I'd love to bring you in now to just talk a little bit about this impact on communities of color and our marginalized student population. Unmute yourself. Will you unmute yourself?
Sorry about that.
No worries.
I don't want to take up too much time, but just to briefly mention from an educational perspective. So a lot of the work I do is in teacher education. I train teachers who are going into the classroom for the first time, or I work with teachers who are interested in developing their educational technology and or their multicultural education skills. Those are the different courses that I teach. And one of the big challenges that many of our students here in the Central Valley faced was not exactly purely technical, but much more sort of socio-technical in nature. And by that, I mean, when we were forced to make the emergency move, right, to remote teaching, so many schools and so many districts were very concerned about how it is we could do school online. Right. And when I say do school, I mean enact the social practices that have become part of the grammar, right? The historical grammar of schooling. Teacher says things, students do work, teacher gives grades, and then we kind of move on. Rather than really stepping back and imagining, given the social and economic disparities that we already live in, right? And given the possibilities that certain kinds of technology afford to us, what could school look like? We did not ask that question. We did not ask the question of what could school look like. We asked the question of how do we do school in the most traditional sense through Zoom, or pick your video provider of choice, and that just did not jive with the technological capacities that we had available to our students and to our teachers. Right? Again, I want to be completely transparent. I am here as an advocate, right, of our students and our teachers. So so that was one of the biggest challenges in my field that we faced and continue to face with regard to the digital divide and communities of color.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Dr. Allison, if I could bring you in, talking about how could we do school digitally, you are so right, Dr. Aguilera. No one asked the question. And I happen to have a non-neurotypical student in my household who's a senior. And I got to tell you that those first few months were painful. For a student that needs to be redirected, for a student that needs one-on-one prompts, that needs some additional help, he found himself quite lost, and there was such a disconnect from doing school this way. And no one really kind of thought about that, right? Like, how does it work for our non-neurotypical students? So Dr. Allison, could you please share some perspective about how this is impacting that cohort of students?
Sure. One thing I'd say is that each student who has a disability has a different interaction with the classroom. So in terms of non-neurotypical, the idea of change is a problem. So when there's an abrupt change and no one addresses the fact that there's an abrupt change, then there can be a significant falling through the cracks. Similarly, our deaf students were suddenly faced with not reading lips because all of a sudden their teachers went from life size in the classroom down to a little square on the screen. Every disability impacts a student in a different way. And every time we change the technology, we need to make sure that we're providing full access as well as the training to use the tools that are available. When I think of the inequalities of our educational system basically grew from a historical process of a small town saying, oh, we've got children, let's hire a teacher. And a teacher would travel from back east and they would pay the teacher out of what the town had. As a result, we're now filled with educational systems that are funded inequitably because they're funded by little bits of population and growth. And some of those populations have less money while others have more money. And then we've added on top of that charter schools and private schools where even more money can be put in to improve your child's chances. So every child with a disability, without a disability, starts out on an unequal playing field in terms of the technology. And we need to look at the structure and change that in order to make sure everyone has the opportunities they need.
Thank you so much. Paul, what about you? Would love to hear your perspective on the digital divide and its kind of direct, impact on marginalized communities.
As I was saying earlier, sometimes it's easy to overlook it because we assume that some groups in our communities, just by dint of the geographic location that they're in, have access. But as we look at things, some of the technical maps showing who has access, a lot of us involved in this are learning more and more that those maps are highly unrepresentative of what's actually going on. The companies, to make a very complex issue very simple, unfairly perhaps, a lot of the companies will determine that people have broadband access if one house in an entire neighborhood or census lot shows that. But of course, that doesn't represent how many people have actually gone in there. And an issue to keep thinking about is the cost of this. As I think Earl said earlier, when you think about what you pay for broadband, and I'm not going to guess here what everybody on the panel or everybody across the country pays because I know it varies a lot, but think about what you pay and then think about somebody in a low income group and the percentage of their income that goes to. There's not a lot of wiggle room there. So I think, sort of circle back in an odd way, but an important way. A lot of what we're facing is an issue of empathy. As we look at people around us, we need to be thinking about the resources they have versus the resources we have, what we can do to support them in getting better things. And I'll be frank, it just really upsets me when I hear people from some of the major providers saying things like, well, the FCC thinks this is the minimum level for broadband, but we don't think everybody needs that. So we're going to set a lower standard and put that out. And you just want to scream. I just want to grow a head of hair so I can pull out some of it out and say, what are you thinking to intentionally go out and try to build inequity in a system that already suffers from inequity?
That is so true. So Dr. Aguilera, let me pitch it back to you. We've been talking about technology access and affordability in terms of broadband, but I think there's another issue that we sometimes forget, which is this notion of digital literacy, right? Even when people have the access, Marie was even talking about something as simple as going through the forms, right? We forget that not everybody, can go through the forms as easily. Or even as Paul mentioned about if you were going to get a COVID, test, you need technology. But let's talk a little bit about digital literacy. Do you see that also as an issue, a problem in communities of color?
Sure. Thank you, Joanna. I think a lot about literacy. So just real quick, my background, I was a high school English language arts teacher and a K-12 reading specialist, right? So sometimes when I tell people what my job is, I say that my job is to teach teachers how to teach kids how to read, right? So literacy is, it's very central to the work that I do. And I always, especially in the last couple of years, I've really tried to work to make sure that people understand that the digital literacy issues that we might be facing today, they're not disconnected, right, from the ones that that came before, right, from the challenges that we faced in the past. I think very much about the notion of literacy, especially in the context of civil rights, right, and I think related to technology. The construct of literacy has also not been treated, in the US at least, right, as an ideologically neutral construct. We know, right, from histories of voter suppression and the ways that literacy tests were used to keep Black and brown people out of the polls, right, that literacy can be weaponized, right, against our communities of color and weaponized against, to be quite frank, our democracy. right? And so when I think about the ways that some people frame digital literacy challenges in this sort of deficit narrative, right? Oh, Black and brown kids, they don't know how to use the computers, or they don't know how to use the technology in this way. I think there is something to be questioned there, right? There's a narrative that I think needs to be questioned. There's some really important work being done by, or that's been published by my colleague S. Craig Watkins and a number of his graduate students, called The Digital Edge. And the subtitle is How Black and Brown Youth, I think, Navigate Digital Inequity. And what he found through about a year and a half, right? They spent about a year and a half at a high school with students, right? Historically marginalized population. The conclusion they came to was that the conditions at the school were not that students were digitally illiterate, but they are being positioned, right, in a way that their literacy practices were not being recognized, right, were not being valued by the institution. I believe the phrase their team used was technology rich, but curriculum poor, right, in that school. And so one of the things I'll be alluding to later on in the panel is the importance of expanding our understanding of what counts as literacy or counts as digital literacy, questioning our assumptions about whose digital literacies count, and then thinking, again, in terms of Dr. Allison's perspective, how do we think about these in terms of systems, right, in terms of structures that we can scale?
Technology rich, but curriculum poor. That is definitely, that kind of resonates with me in terms of what I've been seeing. Marie, what about you? What are we seeing in our tribal communities in terms of this question and the, even more than just the affordability and the access, the actual digital literacy piece of it for communities of color?
All right, hello again. So I would say there's a lot of hesitancy for older generations, especially our elders in our communities, to want to use technology. I know there's that running thing of, oh, get grandma an iPad, she'll love it, right? But that's not the same type of issue you're going to deal with within necessarily a tribal community, right? Get grandma an iPad, what is she going to do with it, right? I mean, there's no internet. Maybe download some games for her. I don't know, but you can hand someone, like we've mentioned, technology, but if you don't hand them the tools or what can they use with that technology, then, what are they going to gain from it? So they would rather not use it, let's say. Also, especially in tribal communities, there's that distrust of, other people, right? There's distrust of the government. There's distrust of a lot of things, right? If you have broken treaties, you're forced to live on a land that's not, where you're from, or it's just displaced and you're kind of just put in this area, right? Here, make it work. Here's some lard and some Spam and have at it, right? The rations that they had to deliver to these Native communities for some time. And now we have a diabetes epidemic in our communities, and we wonder why, right? So it's things of that nature, a lot of distrust that leads them to not wanting to embrace technology either. And so if you're being raised by an elder in your community, let's say a lot of children are being raised by an elder, and grandma doesn't want, right? Your elder doesn't want to embrace technology, then there's not going to be any of it at home. She's not going to try to get internet if it's accessible, right? So that's one element of it. And then another element is just thinking in terms of what are youth using? What are youth using the internet for? Right? And why do they use it in one way and not the other? We need to acknowledge, like, I don't know if you guys have heard of digital citizenship. That's a big thing that goes on in schools now too. So not just digital literacy, but citizenship as well. How do they engage and handle themselves on the internet? Do they know that their location is set up and that someone can easily find their location because they're on Instagram and they shouldn't be on Instagram when they're 10 years old? So, and it happens. I've had many students where I've told them to check their permissions and they realize their locations are up on everything. So it's not just digital literacy, but it's also, the competency and the citizenship aspect. Citizenship in the sense of that's kind of like the generic teacher term they use of being a good person on the internet, right? And understanding not all websites are created equal. So them understanding that as well leads to that digital literacy. Who can they trust? What routes can they use? What is safe and what is not safe? So hopefully that gave a little bit.
Oh, Marie, I wish my kiddos who are in virtual school behind me could hear you say that, because to them, you know, oh no, no one knows it's me. I have a username that's not my name. And I'm like, not only do they know it's you, dear, they can pinpoint where you live, you know. And I have a 13-year-old and a 17-year-old. And my 13-year-old swears, oh, if I put it on Snapchat, I'll delete it, you know. And I'm like, oh yeah, well, just so you know, lives in the ethos for a long time. Someone can screenshot it, it's always there. And that to them, they don't understand the idea of being good digital citizens and what that means. So Dr. Allison, I would love for you to jump in here and just kind of lend your perspective to this literacy conversation.
Yes, one of the things I was thinking was it's still looking at inequalities. Currently, under the age of 11, there are approximately 53% of children have cell phones. So we have this myth that everybody has a computer in their pocket, but no, everybody doesn't have a computer in their pocket. And even only 84% of teenagers. So this is from 2019, an NPR survey. So if that is the number of people who actually have the phone in their pocket, you can imagine that the number who have access to a tablet or a laptop is much lower. And then to have access to somewhere to connect is even lower than that. Marie mentioned older adults. And I was surprised when my mother moved into an independent living community, and there is internet there, provided you go downstairs into the back corner of the lobby. And when we buy things and gifts and things, we think, oh, this is going to be cool. So I bought her, my children and I bought her a frame for photographs that would rotate through the family. And then we couldn't turn it on. We had to take it downstairs, connect it to the internet, make it have an account in order to start the frame, and then take it back upstairs to use it. And if anything goes wrong, we have to take it back downstairs again. Now, in a community of that size, where you're paying a pretty good sized monthly fee to live, why isn't internet available in all of the apartments instead of just in the common areas?
Yes. That is, I know, and I chuckle because I did the same for my mom, right? I'll tell you something funny, and God rest her soul, she was the most amazing woman. This made me chuckle. She actually took the digital frame, Dr. Allison, right, had it up, and took our pictures and taped it to the front of it. Because she couldn't figure out how to, and she's like, it'll just hold the picture. And I go, Mom, that's not how that works. It like scrolls through pictures. She goes, well, I couldn't figure it out. So I had a picture and it had a frame. So there you go. And I went, okay. I never thought of it, right? I never thought let's get this set up for you, Mom. So I just thought that was kind of funny. But but again, so there's assumption. So Paul, I'd love for you to weigh in on this digital literacy conversation and just your perspective and your narrative.
Yeah, digital literacy, I think, is still a concept that very much is evolving. A decade ago, when I was lucky enough to be asked to do a course online for the American Library Association about digital literacy and the digital divide, we spent the first part of the course trying to define it. And we found the same thing there that I found the first time I took a course on it. There was not a clear and present definition of it. I think we've sort of come around now to seeing it as two things. Digital literacy can be sort of a checklist of the things you need to be literate, but that's the weakest of the definitions. The real definition is digital literacy is being able to accomplish something online with the appropriate tools as quickly as you can. When you set that up, it sets us up to understanding that it's a big challenge. You cannot just offer a digital lit course for somebody in your community and assume that's going to meet their needs.
So true, so true. I love that we're having this discussion. And like I said to, folks, if you would make sure you put your comments in the chat area and then your questions that you would like for us to answer in the question and answer area, that would be amazing. What I would love to just talk about now is I would love to transition and really start to get to, so I want to make sure we have a good amount of time to really talk through these, which are the solutions and advocacy piece. The one thing we are proud of here at DLA is we serve as a community platform that provides access to information, access to resources, and gives you, the audience, the opportunity to really kind of do a little bit more investigation, see how you can become allies, and in this instance, in the educational arena. So we will be actually talking about some short-term, some mid-term, and some long-term strategies and suggestions that our panelists have for you for how to kind of address the educational inequity in the digital age, but we'll come to that a little later. But what I would love to do now is I would love for you each to talk about kind of some local, national, or international organizations that you work with, know of, have access to, that you think are working towards improving digital equity and what that work looks like. So I will actually start with Dr. Allison. If you could share what organizations you're working with, and they can be local, national, even international, that you feel like are changing this landscape.
Well, one you've mentioned is the Shaping EDU project. And my introduction to the project was actually an online conference. I'm always seeking to learn more. So in attending that online conference, Shaping EDU looks at student success, leadership, collaboration, digital fluency, and next generation learning. And because they're looking at all of these things and they're bringing together anyone who's interested in those topics, it's like putting wings on the possibility to move forward. So through that, I joined the Universal Broadband Committee, and I'm working with people that I would not have known before, some on my campus, some across the country, people that I would not have met and would not have been able to have these discussions with had it not been for the Shaping EDU, bringing together like-minded folk to work together on topics that were of interest to them.
Wonderful, wonderful. And we have in the chat area. And Dr. Allison, can anyone join the Shaping EDU committee?
As far as I know, Paul could tell you more about it.
I'd love for you to come in here and just talk a little bit more about how do you join, how do you stay connected, and other local, national, or international organizations you're aware of that's changing this landscape and trying to narrow the digital divide.
There are literally hundreds of organizations out there, and the big challenge is to bring the groups together so that united we can be that political front that pushes broadband through at the level that Earl referred to earlier. Our dream through the Shaping EDU initiative is similar to that whole thing of rural electrification, creating a postal service, creating the roadways. This is the big dreamy aspect that people have been pushing for 20, 30 or more years now. And we see the opportunity in the pandemic when everybody's feeling the pain, and it's so prevalent in our news stories everywhere and in daily conversation. This is a time to unite. So starting broad, some of the groups that I'm active in and see as doorways to you, if this is your industry, the American Library Association, Public Library Association, state library associations are great. The FCC is doing major work. We were lucky enough through one of our colleagues at Shaping EDU to make the connection to Jessica Rosenworcel, who is the acting chair of the FCC. She came to one of our meetings to say, what are you doing? And was there a connection? And we said to her, what do you need from us? And her answer was stories. So I would tell you, go to the FCC site. Rosenworcel set up a site after that meeting we had for people to submit their stories. This is what will push this through. And in terms of our initiative, we're there not as a new group saying we're going to break the world or we're going to fix the world or anything like that. It's that dream of let's bring people together, because we are a global group of educators and training consultants saying we want to make a change. Let's bring people together, see what everybody's doing, and try to match those people that can then go to their local, state, and federal legislators and say, do this now, do this yesterday. We don't have the time to not do this. So if you're interested, join us at the link that Brent put into the chat there, or just look for Shaping EDU online and find the project page for it. It's called Connecting Work and Learning. And the goal there is promote universal broadband access throughout the United States. We're excited about it. It's a lot of work. It's not going to happen overnight, but this is the time.
Wonderful. Dr. Aguilera, I would love to bring you in here. If you could share with us kind of resources locally, nationally, internationally that you are aware of working with that is really trying to kind of narrow this digital divide.
Sure, thank you. So I'll talk about it at a couple of levels. So I think if what folks are most concerned about, right, are issues of infrastructure and access around the country, then I certainly would say that the NDIA, the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, would be a great organization to connect to. I think I can just grab this and drop it in the chat. Because as Paul and the rest of our panelists have mentioned, right, there are a lot of complex and intersecting issues happening here, right? But one of the ones that we can sort of take fairly immediate and direct action on, right, is the issue of infrastructure, right, and access. So NDIA, I think, is a good group to connect with if that's kind of your core concern. If you are concerned about how issues of access, right, to broadband and internet technologies might intersect with legal and ethical and surveillance and privacy and censorship concerns, then I would say the EFF is a great place to connect with. The EFF is the Electronic Frontier Foundation. They have been doing work in the area that we sort of commonly think about as net neutrality for a good number of years. And while, yes, they do care about issues of universal broadband, their advocacy and policy efforts really touch on sort of a variety, right, of those areas. Kind of going back to the analogy, right? We've all got pipes, but what is flowing through the pipes, right? Do we have access to clean water? Do we have access to an internet that maybe is a little less poisoned by disinformation, a little less poisoned by hate speech, right? A little less poisoned by so many of the things that that plague us, right? And plague our democracy these days. And then the last organization I'll plug is the AJL, the Algorithmic Justice League. And this is an organization started by Joy Buolamwini. And folks, just a super quick plug, if you haven't yet watched Coded Bias on Netflix, highly, highly recommend you check that out. It is about Joy and about her organization and how she ended up starting that. And the reason I recommend that is, again, going back to what Dr. Allison said, going back to what Marie said, going back to what Paul and Joanne have alluded to, these issues don't happen in isolation, right? These are a continuation of existing social inequities. And one of the things that my colleague Virginia Eubanks has pointed out was that when there are technologies developed, right, technologies of surveillance, technologies that she argues automate inequality, they are often first unleashed on the poor. Right? They are often first unleashed and tested on our most marginalized communities before they are expanded to the rest of society. And so those are the kinds of things you are deeply interested in learning more about and advocating around. Then certainly consider checking out the work of Joy and her colleagues at the Algorithmic Justice League.
Wonderful. Thank you all. That is excellent. I wrote all of those down. And you said Coded Bias. Yes?
Coded Bias, yeah, on Netflix. Really, really good.
I have a whole list of things to watch, because I don't really get to watch many things, but I just pin things because summer's coming and I won't have as many papers to grade. So that'll be.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of sort of what we consider to be academic superstars in our field featured in there. Sophia Noble is in there, Virginia Eubanks, Kathy O'Neill, a lot of really, really important work being done in the area.
Wonderful. Marie, I would love to bring you into this conversation as well as we start to talk about local, national, international resources, organizations that could really help to kind of, narrow this digital divide, if you would. So please, if you could share with us a few of your perspectives.
So in California, there's the Broadband Infrastructure and Improvement Grant. So I know they were allotted millions upon millions of dollars to try to get schools within California to have more access to broadband. So that is something, if you live in a community or your own state, check and see if your state has these grants, see if schools, maybe remote schools that you're affiliated with, maybe they might qualify, that sort of thing, trying to help out your local schools, especially if you don't have kids or your kids are older, right? So you think, well, why do I really care about the schools? My kids are out of school, I'm already done with that, right? But we're raising the next generations, right? So we want to make sure that our local community, right, have this access, right? As well as the FCC, like people have mentioned before, has some good reports on. They've been trying to focus more on Native communities as well and trying to address the inequities as well there. My organization that I work for, the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, which is asis.org, hopefully he can drop that in there. They have been working, it's a national organization. Anyone who's Native, Alaska Native, Pacific Islander, any sort of Indigenous person can sign up and join. It's free for pre-college, so middle schoolers. It's free for high school students to apply, and then they'll get access to scholarships and resources. So ASIS basically has been trying to help with this digital divide. We have been having what's called computer science convenings, and we've had 2 already. We're trying to schedule a 3rd one where we're basically taking a bunch of people's brains and putting them all into a room. So I've been a part of those where I had someone from Intel, someone from, Google, like these big wig tech companies, putting them in a room with teachers who teach on reservations, right? And putting them in a room with college students. So putting them all in a room together. And we've had 2 of these so far, but unfortunately we haven't had a 3rd because of COVID. We're trying to jumpstart that soon, hopefully. Getting all these minds together in one room, whether or not you're Native or Indigenous, and saying, how can you fix these problems? Because like we've had conversations with Intel, okay, yeah, you can throw money at us or throw money at a community, but that's not really going to solve the issue, right? Like we've all mentioned. So trying to get all those talking heads together and be like, here's a teacher right here, talk to her, here is this college student who has to go to McDonald's, talk to them, and getting them all in a room where we are all on a equal level. Equal playing field. You don't feel like, oh, I can't just call up Google and be like, what's up, Google? Why are you like this, right? You can't do that. There's all these barriers. So having these types of conversations, right, especially that ASIS has been having specifically for Indigenous communities, has been great. And we're actually trying to get, we're going to be turning up interest soon. So if you do sign up in ASIS and get their emails, hopefully you might see some flyouts for that if anyone here watching is Indigenous and is interested in that. So, and just anyone in general, if you're a professional working in a tech field. So
that is wonderful. And as I think about it, I think that is oftentimes part of the barrier to entry that we have, which is having an accurate pulse on the end user. Those are the ones that are affected by this. I'm always surprised, and I was sharing with someone the story about seeing, on the news about the 2 kids, I think 3rd and 4th grade, sitting outside of a Burger King on their laptop. And I was very surprised. This was another colleague that said, that's probably not real. The news, puts, and I thought, and she was dead serious. That is because she didn't have context for, and to that she said, everybody has internet. And this is a very smart woman. And it blew me away because I thought, that's that myopic view of something when you don't experience it, that is harming the end user. And it's harming us as communities of color because you're not willing to see that the gaps are huge. And that they exist, and that this is and when you see those stories, that's a slice of a really big pie, right? And so the slices are quite bigger than you're just seeing. So I appreciate you all sharing that. So now I would love to just kind of give people some, again, we're all about transformation. We're all about kind of shifting the pendulum and pivoting so that people feel empowered to kind of start to address change, or even start the conversation. A lot of times people don't even know how to begin the conversation, right? So Dr. Allison, I would love to start with you. Right now, what is one thing that for our attendees that are on that each of us can do to change this digital divide and the lack of digital affluence? And it can be at ASU, it could be at the state level, it could be at the federal level. Please, what do you think? One thing we can do?
I think that people are engaged in a lot of conversations and discussions on a variety of topics. So in whatever group you're a part of, just bring up the need to shift from policies that protect corporations to policies that create infrastructure that allows everyone in. I think just starting that conversation is significant.
Is there a place that you can find kind of those policies? Where would you, if someone wanted to just go and kind of see them listed, see them categorized, be able to kind of dig deeper into that? Is there a place that they can go for that?
I know we're creating a list on Shaping EDU. I don't know that it's published yet, but it will be if it isn't.
Excellent. So stay posted to the Shaping EDU group to see if you can get a list of kind of policies and places you can go to be able to dig deeper into the policies that are written around this issue. What about you, Marie? I'll go back to you here. What is one thing that you would say that people can do now, right? So that each of us can do now to kind of change this at the local, state, federal, even corporate levels?
So again, I kind of alluded to it, so I won't go into that again about ASIS. We're having our own convenings and we're trying to address the situation there. So that's one big thing, getting people together in a room to talk about it. But I would also suggest just within your local communities, if you're not aware of the situation, do a temperature check, basically. What does your local library have? Ours unfortunately burned down last year, so we don't have a local library right now, which has been crazy because that wasn't access to Wi-Fi. So just taking those temperature checks within your own community, right? Do your schools are they considered hotspots for the students that are in the area? When you look at your Wi-Fi on there, is there any open connections? Do kids know that there's secure and unsecured networks, that they shouldn't just connect to everything that they see just because it's an open network, right? So just taking those little temperature checks within your local community and say, well, how can I initiate change within that? How can I help? Can I donate? Can I do something, right, to be a part of it?
Wonderful. As we're actually going through, I'm going to get two other comments from Dr. Aguilera and Paul. But before I do that, speaking of temperature check, I want to just check in with all of you. So those that are in our audience, our attendees, if you could just pull up that word cloud again, I want you to just put in there, what one thing will you do in the next 2 weeks? Right?
Joanna? I'm going to interrupt you. I'm sorry. It's going to be a brand new link, folks. So please don't go to the last one.
Okay.
Give me just a second.
No worries. He's going to pull up a brand new link for you. If you would copy and paste that in your browser, we would love for you, to do a word cloud and hear from you. So the question is, what one thing will you do in the next 2 weeks to work towards improving digital equity? So what will you do? And it could be, hey, I'm going to research Shaping EDU. I'm going to, see about my neighborhood, check with the library, check with my school, whatever thing that you're going to do. If you would just let us know, we'll continue on talking through our one thing that we would love for people to do now. So I'll go to you, Paul, and say, what one thing do you think people can do right now to really kind of, change this in their communities?
The broad answer, which then raises a dozen more questions, is find the people in your community who are impacted by this and are really hurting from it. Find that pain point with those people and join with them to make yourselves visible. I think it's all about visibility. So then the question is, how do you do that? See who's been on local TV programs, see who's been quoted in your newspaper, see who's been quoted in your radio programs. I put a link in just a minute ago to US elected officials. If you want to know who your elected official is, go to that site. identify that and write to them. The best lesson I think I've ever learned about activism and being seen in your community is identify your elected official, who everybody very cynically thinks, oh, is not going to pay attention to me. And you let them know by letter or phone call, politely, mind you, and reasonably and positively, and say, I'm really concerned about this issue. That's the first thing. I'm concerned about this issue. Two, I'm watching what you're doing on this, and either you've been in favor of it or you've not been in favor of it, and express your opinion that I hope you will be in favor of it, because I do pay attention and I do encourage people to vote for people that support this issue. No legislator wants to be told, I am watching you. That kind of gets their attention if you don't do it in a spooky, haunting kind of stalking way, but do it in a positive way, saying, I'm a constituent. This really hurts me. So again, the one-liner is find people of a like mind who are on that issue and unite with them and grow that coalition. That's what Darrow and I have been saying throughout this, and Brent would be on the same thing since he's involved. That's what Shaping EDU is trying to do. Draw attention, be positive, put pressure where it needs to be put so that we achieve what we want to achieve.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Dr. Aguilera, to you, if you could share maybe more than one thing, but just kind of something we can do right now.
Sure. Is it okay if I actually do more than one? Sorry, I'm a teacher and I give lots of homework, so I do apologize.
I am with you. Yes.
I mean, both of my recommendations, they fall broadly under the category of learning more, right? That's just kind of the broad category. And so I think one of the places I alluded to before, but I would recommend people revisit a very specific part of that website now, is the issues section under the Electronic Frontier Foundation. So it's EFF.org/work. And the reason why I recommend that is because, as we've alluded to at the beginning and throughout the panel, digital equity is composed of a lot of intersecting issues, right? Certainly, there are the issues of access and affordability, and certainly there are the issues of infrastructure, but there are a wide variety of issues that intersect and combine, right, in a lot of ways to shape that notion of digital equity or inequity, which is, as we pointed out, a reflection of social inequity. And so whether it is creativity and innovation, whether it is free speech, whether it is international issues, issues of privacy, issues of security, issues of transparency, find something that speaks to you and dig in a little more about it, right? And so that way, when you take Paul's suggestion and write to your elected officials, you can speak in a way that you feel confident about, right? You can speak in a way that really reflects something that is close to your heart, right? And true to your heart. And I think the EFF, among the many organizations that are doing really important work, I feel like the EFF has done a very good job of putting many of these issues in plain language that any of us, we may not be programmers, but we can understand, right, how these issues affect our lives. So that would be one thing. The other piece of homework that I would give is to find somebody young. Find somebody young and ask them to teach you something that they know, right, about the technologies they use every day, whether it's a person who is doing gaming, a person who is navigating social media, a person who is designing and recording and publishing TikToks. Put yourself, there's a mindset in Buddhist philosophy called Shoshen. It refers to the beginner's mind, right? And so I invite you to put yourself into the beginner's mind and learn from somebody. Ask them, humbly to share a little bit of their life and their world with you. And again, keeping in mind this notion that we don't always recognize everybody's digital literacies equally. See what it is you can learn from that person. Now, again, I don't not to be ageist, but I particularly recommend speaking to young people because oftentimes, again, as we know as teachers, young people tend to see the world in a very different way, right, than those of us that have had kind of more experience in it, right? Not to say it's better or worse, but it is different, as a lot of people have pointed out. And so again, that's why I recommend speaking to a young person, asking them to show you their world and be really earnest about your listening, be really earnest about your questions, about your learning, because there really is something to be learned about what it is to navigate the digital world that we've begun to build together from the folks that grew up in it.
That is such an excellent suggestion. And if you ever go to my kids' TikTok, you'll see some of the most terrifying TikTok challenge dances I've done with my 13-year-old. Trust me, I'm like, what are we doing now? It's like, but again, that's their world. It becomes their language and how they communicate. And I think that is such an excellent suggestion because sometimes we forget that for like my 13-year-old, that's all he's ever known. He can also, which is kind of funny, he can come to my computer if I'm having issues. He's like, oh, I'll clean this up, check and, make sure you don't have any viruses and he knows how to do it. I'm like, you're 13. How do you know that? And then he's like, go ahead, scrub it and shut it down. And I'm thinking, okay, that's cool. But it is a language. And I have to tell you that when I ask, for him to show me something, because I think as parents, as adults, sometimes we're so much in the driver's seat that, they're learning from us. When I ask, I see a whole world open up. Same with my older son. He loves technology. My older son wants to be a filmmaker. So the things that I see him do, I'm like, I didn't even know you could do that. And my son will say, you have iMovie, right? And I'm like, oh, didn't know that. I'm like, where is it? And he's like, at the bottom of your, I had no clue. I mean, that's something I should know since I have my Mac, but I have really enjoyed and I love this notion of shoshin, this idea of a beginner's mind, because I think for a lot of us, we get very complacent. We get very, we know everything. And I know even as an instructor at ASU, I'm very open to my students. And part of what I love is how much I learn from them. And I think if we can do that more, we can really kind of, increase the exchange of information kind of back and forth. So I love that. I will, any other last pieces that you want to add, any of you, Dr. Aguilera?
Yeah, just a quick, I just want to bounce off, some of the stuff that you mentioned. I think it's, there's a lot of fun stuff that happens on platforms like TikTok. And I think it's great. It is a fun platform, right? And prior to that, Vine was a fun platform. But again, when we start to take this stuff seriously, there's also a lot of like really powerful work happening on there. Not too long ago, I was on a panel talking about gaming, right, and the literacies of gamers. And there's an individual, a young Black man, who created a TikTok about sort of racist and white supremacist attacks online, right? We know that these things are endemic, right? In particular in the gaming community. Part of it is due to lack of regulation, but part of it is due, of course, to deeper social issues that have much less to do with technology and much more to do with histories of imperialism and colonialism. But he put together a TikTok about, so there's a little bit of background here. There's a genre of gameplay called speed running, where you try to play a game as fast as you possibly can to demonstrate sort of your technical expertise, right? All of the hours that you've practiced and how much you've learned the system. So what this gamer did is he put together a short TikTok called "How Fast Can I Be Called the N-Word Online?" And he had an overlay, and he had, a timer, and he had all this stuff set up. And, he presented it as if you watch it, it's presented as a piece of comedy, right? And yet, when you take it seriously, it is some of the more powerful social commentary I've seen, right, in recent days. And this is on TikTok. This is not New York Times. This is not The Atlantic. This is TikTok, right? This is just young people giving voice and paying attention to social inequity in the world and spreading a message about it. So I just wanted to comment that it was really great that you brought that up. And I think, the more that we can think through and have conversations about these, I think the more that we can learn about ourselves, right? Because obviously we don't have all the answers, but the more that we can learn about the world around us that we're continuing to build together.
So true. Any other comments in terms of one thing that we want to add? Maybe you thought of a second as we were all chatting. So does anyone want to add anything else to what we've shared before we go to our Mentimeter. So hopefully you all have put in words there about the one thing you're going to do as attendees in the next 2 weeks to kind of shift this. So if you have not done that, please go ahead and add your one thing or several things, and we'll pull up that Mentimeter. Anyone else want to add anything? Okay, great. Let's go to Brent. If we could take a look at that and see what folks have put in for the one thing they're going to do. Excellent. So the question was, what one thing will you do in the next 2 weeks to work toward improving digital equity? Some of the things we have on here is survey. Folks have talked about research, add to library, share on blog. Someone has said they would investigate more, do a temperature check. We also have folks saying they will do a call to their representatives and increase visibility, hotspots, activism. Let's see, someone says develop my thesis. So I'm assuming that someone is working on a thesis around this digital equity piece of it. We've got resources, knowledge. So this is great. Educate. This is wonderful. Check references provided. Wonderful. So we do that so that you all feel that's part of empowerment. We are very clear that, you know, resources and tools, that is how you learn. And when we provide that, I'm so happy that you all are looking into those and really kind of moving forward. What I would like to do is I would like to just take a quick, I know we've got a couple of questions, and Dr. Scholar, I think we've got a few questions that we have in here, and I would like to just ask that one question, please, or the few questions we have to the panel.
Yeah, we have that one question. We're going to bring Christine Williams to allow to talk.
Okay.
So she can ask her question live. Hi, Christine.
Hi, Brent.
Hi, Christine. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Your question, please.
So I was wondering, we talk a lot about digital divide in spaces of education, but as we've seen this year, it's also a space in the workplace and your ability to work when we've had to move to remote work. So I've just been wondering, like, as you guys were talking, how do we see workplaces helping to advocate for broadband in all homes? And I know, at least in the region I live in, ultimately right now that's ended up in pretty large subsidies to staff to aid in getting broadband in all the workforce's homes, which has also allowed student access to that resource. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are as we think about who the advocates and allies are, where workplaces come into that space.
That is, Christine, what an excellent question. You know, as I moved to working from home and I'm homeschooling 2 kids, we had so much interruption, right? Because it's like, and when I called my provider, their solution was, you've got to pay for a higher speed internet, right? So that everybody's online at the same time, which is like, okay, I have the luxury and the privilege to be in a position to accommodate that. But what if folks aren't? So for those that are working from home, Dr. Allison, I would love for you to weigh in on this question from Christine.
Yes, I think that a lot of people have found themselves working from home and having to pay more ad services. What ASU did was provide hotspots, including to staff who needed them. So I think when you talk to employers, encourage them to consider that our society changed. You know, when everyone went home last March, everything changed, and the change is not going to completely roll back. I heard yesterday that one company had decided that they were not going to reopen their office. Another decided to open their office in a limited way so that people could come in on some days and remain home on other days, and there would be a smaller footprint. So I think what's important is for the business owners, the managers, the CEOs and CIOs to push for greater access in the communities around their companies. They need to encourage that not only that broadband be available, but that broadband be affordable and broadband be consistent. I know I had wired broadband when I was in one of my homes, And I gave up on that and went to DSL because they were consistently dropping the speed while I was in the middle of something. And, you know, it was just stop. It's like, well, wait a minute, I'm trying to do my work here. Why are you stopping just because I'm at home instead of in the office? That was prior to COVID. My second home, I have an excellent cable network and it's plugged in and it's consistent. But we need to have consistency across the board. Communities that say we're building these houses with wide Wi-Fi access, they need to have consistent access, not access that's, oh, really good when we want to, and then it drops when we think that somebody else needs that bandwidth.
Oh, excellent. Anyone else want to weigh in on Christine's question? Paul, Marie, Dr. Aguilera, anybody else? Paul?
I'd love to add in. I absolutely agree with everything Adero just said. And strangely enough, the whole thing sends me back to what Brent said at the very beginning when he was laying out the ground rules for our discussion today. I just went back and highlighted two of them. This idea of, for our discussion, I would say in the workplace, among employers and employees, listen actively and be open to the full spectrum of perspectives and try to relinquish the need to be right. This has been a very painful period for all of us. It's been a tragic period for all of us. And yet out of that have come some really good things if we listen and learn. I've said over and over again, among the best colleagues I have, I'm impressed by those who say, we don't want to go back to normal. We don't want to go back to a new normal. We want to work together to create a new and better normal because frankly, the past normal was not all that good to want to go back to. So as we talk about the workplace and what we can do, employees need to be forthright in a positive way with the employers about here's what I'm facing. And if you want the best out of me, here's what I really need. We need to do this together. And employers need to say the same thing to the employees. What are you experiencing? What do you need so we can get the best out of you? What can we do together? I think if we approach it that way in our workplaces, we can make magnificent positive changes. And I'm not going to be Pollyannish enough to think that every employer will want to hear that, nor am I going to be Pollyannish enough to think that every employee will be comfortable being that assertive. But that's what it's going to take from those of us that have it in us to approach it that way.
And also, thank you so much, Paul, for that. Thank you so much, Dr. Allison, for that. The other thing is, you know, and thank you for your question, Christine. The other thing is to also eliminate the stigma around that. I really hate having to explain to someone, you know, they're like, well, why don't you have this? Why don't you have 5G? And they just make it kind of this, and it's just so much stigma around not having access. And I'm like, I don't want to have to explain to you why, you know what I mean? It's my situation. I'm working through my situation, but not to have the stigma around it. You know, I have some colleagues that work from home and, you know, they're like, there's this expectation, right? That you have a background, that you have your camera on, that you know, all of these things where, you know, for some, especially like, I'll tell you the example with my son, who's on the autism spectrum. He's not always comfortable with turning his camera on, and he had to explain to the teacher that I'm listening, you know, but sometimes when there's a lot of people on the screen, I can't watch everybody, especially if they're doing something, right, and listen to you at the same time, you know. So you gotta, which is more important to you, that I'm able to get the information or that you see me? And that was great advocacy on his part, but it was really important that, you know, we understand that there's sometimes a lot of stigma in this digital space that comes with what you should be able to do, how comfortable you are with it, you know, whether your camera's on or off. So that's really something that I'm so happy that we're beginning to advocate, you know, for people that are working from home, that are homeschooling, that are in these virtual environments. So I would love to wrap up. We're at that time now. I know that went by very quickly. I'm like, whoa, it's 10:45. I would love to just hear from each of you. If we could have some final words and closing comments from each of you. And we'll start with you, Marie, and we'll move to Paul, and then Dr. Allison and Dr. Aguilera. So if we could do it in that order. Marie, the floor is yours.
All right. So yeah, final words. I would just say, like I mentioned before, doing a temperature check. Also what Earl and Paul had talked about, writing to your representatives as well, especially during COVID. That was a big key element, is calling a representative and telling them you needed stimulus checks, right? You needed your unemployment to go through, right? Those types of things were very important during this past year. So that's a big thing too. And a lot of just everyday people aren't aware that they can do that as well. So that's a big key thing for me. And also just in general, if this is your first time hearing more about Indigenous communities and tribal communities, to do some more research to try to understand, well, why is it the way it is? There's a lot of stereotypes about Native people, who they are and what they do. And we're often thought of in the past tense. When you go to a lot of museums and things, we're seen as people from long ago, the Wild West, right? We're not seen as current, everyday, thriving people, or who are attempting to thrive, but are not being allowed to thrive due to lack of access to internet, lack of access to clean water, right? Pipelines trying to go through their lands. And then as soon as the government pushes to get it through their lands, something breaks, right? When they told you don't do it in the first place, right? So just acknowledging your local communities, if you have any, or just learning more about the broader, how Alaska has villages, right? How Hawaii has their own Native populations as well, right? There's more to it than just the everyday community, because oftentimes Natives are considered the invisible minority, right? We're statistically insignificant in that our populations are so low that when you see, rates for this group is so high and rates for this group, but you never see Natives on that list. So think about why you don't see it. And if you type in, rates of this, Native American, right, add something to it, then oftentimes you will find a report. But because it was not statistically significant enough to include in like the Washington Post or something, we get labeled as something else. Like literally was called something else in the elections as to who, I think it was it Arizona? Where they called them something else. And it's like, oh, okay, I guess we're something else, guys. So just knowing that Native populations are often not represented in the national light, but we are here, we are thriving. So yeah, just learn about it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marie.
So jumping on what Marie said, everything she said, double over. That's just great advice. If I were trying to distill it to one line, I would say, tell your story. And expand that, tell your story and the story of the people around you. Find the audiences that need to hear that, the FCC, Shaping EDU, your local legislators, your state legislators, your national legislators, the people in the associations, the professional groups you may be part of. But tell your story, do it eloquently, do it from the heart, do it positively. That's what's going to make change.
Wonderful.
I would say that as you not only tell your story to those larger organizations, tell your stories one-on-one to your neighbors, to other people who need to know, so they can begin to share that story as well, and to let people know that this is a problem that we all need to fix.
Excellent. Dr. Aguilera, final words?
Yeah, just keeping in mind everything that folks have said all throughout these last couple of hours. I guess the one thing I'll add is just don't forget you're not in this alone. There is power in community. There's power in unity, right? Whether it is approaching your employer not as an individual, but as a group, or whether it's joining a larger organization and getting a sense of what resources are already out there that you can lend your voice to. I know oftentimes in the US, we're socialized into this culture of individualization. And while there may be value in that, it's also important to keep in mind that is a very cultured worldview, right? And there are I'm constantly reminded by folks like Yolanda Celi Ruiz and my colleague, Dr. Patricia D. Lopez here at Fresno State, that I am because we are, right? The Ubuntu philosophy. And so, yeah, so think about the importance of yourself, absolutely, and your stories, but also think about how we can join together, right? And how we can move together in unity toward a goal that unites all of us.
I love that. Thank you all so much. That's going to stay with me. I am because we are. That is powerful and something that I definitely resonates with me. And for me, I just want to say to all of you that are attending today, continue to learn, right? Learning is this ongoing process there's no end to it. And also try to do things that are actionable. Take action steps as opposed to things that are performative. So don't worry too much about posting that black square. I'd much rather you support an organization, right? That's trying to move the needle forward as opposed to just doing things or hashtag stop Asian hate. That's all wonderful and there's a place for it, but don't do things that are simply performative in nature. Be a co-conspirator that will actually, right, try to move the needle towards change and towards advocacy, because it is literally going to take all of us. I am so grateful to each of you for your time today. That was absolutely wonderful. And hopefully all of you learned something as well. So grateful for you all to join us. At this time, I would love to bring in the head of our education committee responsible for putting on our monthly workshops, Dr. Mallory Titel, who will leave us with some closing remarks. Dr. Titel.
Well, thank you, Joanna. Excuse me. Thank you, Joanna. I appreciate that. I am not responsible. It's not that I don't take responsibility. There are just many, many people standing behind me or next to me or even in front of me who help put these amazing programs together, as you all know. Again, my name is Mallory Titel, and I have the great pleasure of leading the Education Committee as chairman here at the DLA. And I also want to give some recognition to a few of the many key people that were responsible for today's programming. First, I definitely want to recognize our board, but I certainly want to say up front, thank you, Marie and Paul and Dr. Allison and Dr. Aguilera, and of course, Joanna, who is a masterful facilitator. And here we see her with our board of directors as well. Definitely want to thank our board of directors and our fearless co-founder, Marion Kelly, excuse me, pardon me, Marion Kelly, for the strategic guidance and leadership and oversight of the DLA, gosh, for the past 20 years, if you can certainly believe that. Thank you, every one of my fellow board members. I would also like to thank our education committee. And these are just some of the folks. As I said, there are many, many people who helped put this together. I would like to thank the education committee, who are responsible not only for today, but for the monthly workshops. We all work together very closely. And again, I'm sorry, there's a frog here too. Again, thank you, Joanna, who always provides amazing input, suggestions, and ideas, and is always there when needed. And also Dr. Brent Scholar for facilitating, again, getting our panelists on board, doing a lot of the behind scenes stuff. And of course, special recognition to Dr. Brent for driving the technical planning here. We are so grateful for his continued support and managing that process, which luckily I don't have to do. So thank you. I also want to take a moment to be sure and thank our sponsors, without whom we would not be here today. We really appreciate the support of the community at large, and of course our sponsors. Tegna Foundation, Channel 12, for awarding the DLA a 2021 programming grant. Special thanks to Emily Bowers, Carl Watts, and of course the amazing Tram Mai. Thank you to Marion Kelly, again, our own Marion Kelly, and the Mayo Clinic for the Everybody In Fund for Change grants, who support our Uncomfortable Conversations and Dialogue series. And lastly, a special thank you to the Black Philanthropy Initiatives Grant Fund and Ms. Kim Covington of the Arizona Community Foundation. Again, there are many people behind these efforts, and I want to take a moment to thank you all for them.
Dr. Titel, thank you so much. We are grateful for your leadership and support, and to all of your education committee members for continually driving such important topics. I would love to bring Brent in at this time, Dr. Scholar, if you would, to just talk a little bit about what we have coming up next. I know we've got a special edition conversation happening at the end of the month.
Certainly. Hello, everybody again. Here we go. All right. This is for Paul, or I mean for Earl, because he said he wanted to see me on the screen. Yes, we have something really amazing coming up, and I'm going to toot her horn. It is our great Joanna Deshay who's putting this together for 29th of April, same bat time, same bat channel, we'll be here. But we're going to be doing We Are Not Silent, Stories in Support of the Asian American and Pacific Islanders. This is what has been going on. We talked about it a little bit earlier today, and we are bringing together a very special panel for you at the last minute. But we are glad to say that we are going to be hosted and moderated by Tram Mai, our news anchor from Channel 12. So for anyone who was here last month, you saw her there with a bunch of wonderful ladies. So please, everyone, also head over to our website or our YouTube channel. You can see all of our webinars there. If you have missed them, do not worry. But let me read you just a little bit about what this next special edition is going to be about. It's about a community dialogue, again, in a safe space and place to listen and learn while acknowledging the hurt and pain and fear that many have experienced and witnessed in their AAPI communities. So we're going to dive into this deeply. I've just posted the link. You will be the first ones to be able to register. Please register early. We only have 500 spots, and we feel like this is going to be one of our hot topics. Okay, so bear with me as I do multitasking here. We also want to say thank you to everybody. Of course, we have our sponsors, but you too. If you want to volunteer, please contact Mallory Titel. You can do so through our website, contact us. Awards at Diversity Leadership Alliance, that will get me. .org, and I can forward it on if you want. That's totally fine. Or we think we have leadership at diversityleadershipalliance.org. All ways you can get in touch with us. Please volunteer so that we can bring on these great programs. Also, if you've enjoyed today's workshop and the content, please consider supporting DLA further by making a $20 donation or more if you're able, so you can celebrate our 20th anniversary year. Your donations are going to help us maintain these programs throughout the entire year. So please think about that. Also know that we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, so your donations may be tax deductible.
Excellent. Dr. Scholar, thank you for your continuous support in front of the camera, behind the scenes, and all around. It is always a pleasure to work with you, and thank you to all of you for joining us. We do, 1 minute take, for granted your time. It's the one commodity we don't have enough of. So we are grateful that you chose to spend it with us here today. Another special thank you to our panelists. You all have filled my cup today with some great information. I took notes as well, because there's some further research that I would like to do. So special thank you to Dr. Earl Aguilera, Marie Casau, Dr. Adero C.E. Allison, and Paul Signorelli. Thank you all so much. We are grateful for your time and expertise. And to all of you, we look forward to seeing you on the 29th for our special edition DLA conversation in support of and sharing stories with our AAPI community. And a special thank you to Tram Mai for agreeing to moderate that. She is such a supporter. Channel 12 and Tegna are big supporters, and we are grateful that they chose us. They chose DLA to afford a grant to this year. We are very grateful to that. To all of you, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day. And most importantly, please be good to each other. Thank you so much for joining us for Uncomfortable Conversations that Ignite Change. Cheers.